Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the post-World War II settlement of Europe and the division of Europe between the United States and the sort of capitalist regions and the Soviet Union and the communist ones, the rising of the Iron Curtain, and some of the first strokes and counterstrokes of this thing that is eventually going to dominate the rest of this unit's foreign policy, the Cold War. So, here are our objectives for today. Let's move on. We didn't talk a lot about the pre and post war conferences during the earlier parts of this unit. We briefly mentioned Tehran and Dumbarton Oaks. But we haven't talked about the Yalta Conference yet. So this conference, of course, happens still during the war. Churchill is still Prime Minister of Great Britain. Roosevelt is still King of America, and Joseph Stalin is still the Iron Man, Joseph Stalin. At Yalta, it was decided, sort of the post-war, the war was not in doubt anymore, and so Yalta was mostly about what's going to happen to the world post-World War II. How are the victorious Allies going to deal with Germany? How are they going to deal with Japan? Things like that. Those sort of issues are really sort of that stuff where they were sitting down to talk about at Yalta. And it was totally understood at Yalta that, at least in the European theater, Russia had borne the brunt of the fighting. The suffering of the Soviets was absolutely immense, and so Stalin wanted to make sure that Germany would be dismembered and that the Soviet Union would have a series of buffer states in order to prevent stuff like this from happening before. Because, again, despite the fact that Russia did defeat Nazi Germany, the cost of this for the Russians was just absolutely immense. And so it was totally understood that Stalin did a lot of the heavy lifting for this war, and we really, as far as like owing who was most responsible for the destruction of Hitler. Stalin and the Soviet Union played a huge role here. And so in the post-war settlement, Roosevelt was totally comfortable allowing Stalin to get a significant portion of what he wanted at Yalta. And so what did he want at Yalta? Well, one, the dismemberment of Germany into 4 separate zones of occupation. Here's a British zone, a Soviet zone, an American zone, and a French zone. He also wanted to, we also decided we would divide up the city of Berlin into 4 zones as well. And so Germany learns the lesson that, you lose 2 world wars and you don't get to be a country anymore. And so Germany is going to be partitioned amongst the victorious allies. Here's Henry Wallace's speech here. Who's, again, Henry Wallace was Roosevelt's former vice president in his 3rd term, and he's going to feature prominently coming forward here, especially in the next lesson. So we'll introduce him here. He's kind of a leftist, and in general, he's talking about cooperation with the Russians. And for the most part, in this context, Roosevelt agreed with him. He allowed Stalin to do a significant portion of what he wanted. He said that whoever sort of liberated these captive areas would be able to rebuild them. Stalin promised that free and fair elections would be happening in the territories occupied by the Red Army, and Roosevelt mostly took him at his word. Stalin also agreed that he would join the war in the Pacific, and the Soviets would get a sphere of influence in Manchuria, and they might even they're going to partition up other portions of Asia as well. By the Potsdam Conference, the tenor and the participants are very different. Obviously, Joseph Stalin's still there, but Winston Churchill has lost his election and been tossed from power and is replaced by Clement Attlee there and his fabulous mustache. FDR has died and now is replaced by Harry Truman of Missouri. And so he's going to view Stalin very differently than Roosevelt did. He's going to argue for much tougher terms against Stalin, and he's going to end Potsdam. Whereas Yalta was a general, happy consensus amongst the big 3. Potsdam is going to be much more contentious, especially after, the Soviets are still occupying significant parts of Eastern Europe. And pretty quickly, all of these states are going to set up their own, Soviet socialist republics. The German-occupied part is going to adopt a communist government, as is Poland, as is Czechoslovakia, as is, Romania, places like that. These areas are going to become known as Soviet satellites because the understanding, at least in the West, is that this was not a freely chosen choice by the people, that all of this was forced upon them because of occupation from the Red Army. And there's significant tension here about what's going to happen to other parts of the world. Are the Soviets going to keep expanding after the war? How are we going to deal with this problem? Because the Red Army at this point significantly outnumbers any sort of allied mobilization. And so if it comes to a land war in Europe, there's really not that much that we could do to stop the Reds from sweeping across Germany and taking everything all the way to the English Channel. So Truman understands these realities, but at the same time, the United States has a trump card, this whole atomic bomb thing. We, of course, did not know at this point that the Soviets had infiltrated our nuclear program and were fast on their way to developing their own atomic bomb. But Truman also refused to share atomic technology with the Soviets or with anyone else. And we're going to keep our atomic monopoly secret and private for as long as is possible. And this becomes Truman's trump card that he can play whenever he doesn't want Stalin to do something. He can threaten dropping atomic bombs on people. And there's really no response to that beyond the fact that, obviously it would lead to a massive global war that would probably, destroy the world. In the aftermath of the war, we created the United Nations, which you're hopefully familiar with. I'm not going to go into lots of detail of the United Nations. It's divided up into a bunch of councils and stuff like that. But you should probably know the General Assembly, where all the nations get a seat, and the Security Council, the cool kids table, in which you have the 5 permanent members: England, China, France, Russia, or the Soviet Union, and the United States. And by China, we'll get into what we mean about that tomorrow. And you have the 10 rotating members who are elected out of various regions of the General Assembly. The permanent members of the Security Council have the right to veto basically anything. And this is going to be really problematic going forward for the UN, especially during the Cold War, and honestly, all the way to today. Because it's very unlikely that, Russia and the United States are going to see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. And so there's going to be a lot of vetoing, and it's going to be very difficult for the UN to sort of navigate the conflict between these two countries. We decide after World War II that we're going to have war crimes trials. Of course, hopefully you're familiar with the famous Nuremberg trials, to put German leaders on trial both for their war crimes in the Holocaust, but also general awful conduct of Germans. We're also going to have war crimes trials in Japan, putting the leaders of a Japanese society on trial. We do not put the emperor on trial. That's sort of one of the things that Douglas MacArthur, the guy who is leading our military government in Japan, does as an olive branch to the Japanese people. But a number of high-ranking Japanese officers are also put on trial. And it's basically decided at Nuremberg that the excuse, well, I was only following orders, does not excuse some of the really horrible conduct, especially in regards to the Holocaust and things like that. And so we are going to try to hold people accountable for their actions in the aftermath of World War II, and are marginally successful in doing that. We create the State of Israel and this partition plan right here in 47, which falls apart immediately for reasons that I can't figure out. That looks to me like a totally rational map of 2 separate countries. And so, in the end, the creation of the State of Israel is really problematic because, on the one hand, European countries and honestly the world are pretty embarrassed about the fact that the Holocaust was allowed to happen and that they didn't do more to step in and both save Jewish refugees and to stop the Holocaust. And so there's an understanding that there needs to be a Jewish state, a Jewish nation state. But on the other hand, the people living there already, the Palestinians, need to have some territory for themselves too. And the Arab League, sort of led by Egypt and Syria and Jordan, are going to invade and attempt to destroy Israel immediately. And so, with the backing of the United States and the allies, the Israeli army counterattacks, pushes back, and takes significantly more territory than was originally agreed to. This is going to be a constant problem as far as where the borders of Israel end, where a Palestinian state might be. What do we do with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and some of these areas? And so, honestly, we don't have any answers to this right now. It's something that we're still arguing about at this moment, but just know that the current fight over Israel goes back to the post-World War II settlement, when, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, we felt that a Jewish homeland was absolutely essential. We get a series of crises in between Stalin and Truman in the period after the Cold War. As we mentioned, Truman was a more consummate Cold Warrior than FDR. He was much more skeptical of Stalin. There was a question about Iran, for example. Iran was originally divided up, partitioned between British and Russians. The British are going to be losing a lot of their colonial holdings in the post war period. And so there's a real question of what should happen to Iran. And so, in the aftermath of the war, the Soviets refused to withdraw troops, hoping to make Iran part of their sort of satellite network. We demanded a withdrawal, sending naval resources into the region, and the Soviets withdraw in exchange for the promise of some oil reserves along the Caspian Sea. This is also the first example where Harry Truman threatened to use nuclear weapons if the Soviets didn't withdraw, which again is a trump card that you can play, except if you ever actually do it, it's going to lead to a global war that'll probably destroy us all. But we see a clear divide between the United States and the Soviet Union at this point, as their interests are starting to diverge now that their common enemies have been defeated. This divide between the communist and capitalist world becomes known as the Iron Curtain. As the Soviet Union solidifies its control over its puppet governments and the United States commits to rebuilding Western Europe, the divide between communism and capitalism in Europe becomes much more stark. Eventually, these borders are going to be closed, travel between these two worlds are going to be sharply restricted, and there's going to be almost constant tension along these areas as the Soviet Union attempts to expand communism into areas and the United States attempts to prevent that from happening. From the United States perspective, of course, Stalin is taking over and using the power of the Red Army to fix elections, set up puppet governments, and build his own power. From the Soviet perspective, the United States is afraid of communism, is stifling free thought, and is not allowing, Russia and not allowing, people to choose their own path. And we're, from the Soviet perspective, we are as committed to pushing all of these countries to stay democratic capitalists as Stalin is to train them into sort of authoritarian communist regimes. Our general strategy, articulated by a guy named George Kennan in the Long Telegram, is called containment. We understand that rollback is probably impossible. We're never going to get the Red Army pushed out of Eastern Europe. That's just not a thing that's going to happen without substantial cost of life and basically World War III. If we try to push the Red Army out of Europe, it'll lead to World War III. And so instead, the goal is to try to stop the Russians from expanding into other places, to stop them from expanding into India, to stop them from expanding into Iran, to slow their expansion into China, to keep them out of Korea. Basically, to allow the places that are still communist to stay communist because there's nothing we can do about it, but to prevent them from spreading further. And we're going to use a whole bunch of different tools to try to do that. Here's a famous Truman speech about containment. So take a moment, pause, and read. Take note of these themes because you're going to see them for our foreign policy basically for the next 30 years. You're going to see constant references to this battle of ideologies, to this battle of worldviews, and to this struggle between communism and capitalism for the rest of the world. The Truman Doctrine is going to be to provide aid to countries fighting against communism. At this point, specifically, we're going to try to prop up the economies of Greece and Turkey with the understanding that if capitalist economies are functioning somewhat well, communism seems like a less sort of palatable option. And so we're going to metaphorically hit Greece with the money train before Stalin could hit them with the communism train. And so we're going to try to stop communism from spreading down here to Greece and Turkey. And it, for the most part, works. So here's Kennan articulating containment. And we're going to move on. Expanding out the Truman Doctrine, we have the Marshall Plan, where we're going to provide substantial amounts of aid to rebuild Western Europe. Especially after, so we offer this Marshall Plan aid to pretty much all the countries in Europe. Obviously, England, France, Western Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands are going to get the vast majority of it because they were the most devastated parts of the United States here. Spain, because they're fascist, is going to be kept out. We're also going to offer Marshall Plan aid to places like Czechoslovakia, but the prime minister, the leader of Czechoslovakia suffers an unfortunate accident falling out a window and dying before he can accept Marshall Plan aid. And then the new leader of communist Czechoslovakia turns down American money, and instead follows the sort of Soviet model of forced collectivization, forced labor, stuff like that. And so the end result of this is Western Europe is going to be rebuilt relatively quickly. Eastern Europe is going to remain in ruins for a significant portion of time and are going to adopt sort of this Soviet Stalinist communist model of, again, collectivization and, political oppression. The Soviet perspective of this, of course, is that the Marshall Plan is an attempt to spread capitalist ideas and undermine communist regimes. Here's the Soviet spokesperson at the United Nations speaking about this, so take a moment, pause, and read. And the Berlin crisis is a response to this. So, in addition to the whole Czechoslovakia thing, Stalin is also going to try to seize control of the entire city of Berlin. He's going to close road and rail travel into the western portions of Berlin. So, as you hopefully remember, we had divided Germany up into 4 different zones. It turned out England and France weren't really economically or politically capable of rebuilding their parts of Germany on account of how devastated they'd been from the war. And so the United States is going to take over those 2 areas, creating a Western Germany and an Eastern Germany. In response, Stalin is going to try to seize all of Berlin by closing all road and rail traffic into the city in order to hopefully prevent, to make the people of Western Berlin ask for Soviet aid. And then once the Soviet food comes in, the Soviet troops will also come in, and Berlin will disappear behind the Iron Curtain. They're also going to cut out power, coal, food, all this stuff. And so Truman now has a difficult problem because if he invades in order to try to fight off this clearly aggressive move by Stalin, it could lead to World War III. So how do you respond without aggravating Stalin too much? What we get is the Berlin airlift. So Operation Vittles, for 11 months, we're going to drop millions of pounds of food from these bombers into Western Berlin. Most famously, of course, the candy bombers, bringing in candy for children in Western Berlin. The Soviets are, of course, going to try to block this with some of their air assets, but they are going to be hesitant to shoot down American planes bringing sort of humanitarian aid. And so Stalin decides that it's not worth risking war to shoot down these planes, bringing in needed supplies. And the Berlin crisis ends with Stalin backing down and opening up road and rail traffic back into Berlin after 11 months. This represents the sort of complex way in which the Cold War is going to be fought, because both sides understand that a military confrontation would be utterly devastating. So it's a question of how much can you confront people without confronting people. But, of course, both sides have to remain prepared for a military confrontation, and so neither side effectively demobilizes. The Red Army continues to sit right on the border of the Iron Curtain, preparing to potentially invade and destroy Western Europe. And the United States does cut back on military spending to some extent, but it never gets down to its pre-war levels. And the United States is going to maintain an almost permanent wartime footing in case war with the Soviet Union is necessary. We see this through things like the National Security Act of 1947. This creates this whole National Security Council, a Secretary of Defense overseeing, the 3 branches of the military. We're going to separate out the Air Force from the Navy and the Army, although we're going to, of course, also allow, the Navy to have an Air Force and the Army to also have some air assets. And so it's complicated. We're going to create out this new thing called the Air Force, and we're going to continue to fund all of these things. So we're going to have a standing Army, a standing Navy, and a standing Air Force, even at peacetime, just in case we need to go to war with the Soviets. We're also going to create Strategic Air Command. This is a branch of the Air Force that's responsible for delivering and deploying nuclear weapons if necessary. And it's at this time that we're going to adopt the atomic blitzkrieg strategy, by which, if war actually comes, we're going to drop all of these nukes on the Soviet Union and their allies. So as we build up huge nuclear stockpiles, our basic plan is if war with the Soviet Union comes, we are going to mercilessly nuke almost the entirety of the Soviet Union. So that's a little terrifying because it sets up this whole system of mutually assured destruction. Because once the Soviets start to develop their own nuclear weapons, it's understood by people on both sides that if war becomes between these 2 sides, both sides will be utterly obliterated. So MAD, or mutually assured destruction, becomes the sort of main deterrent to war, because at the end, there'll be nothing left. This is eventually going to evolve into NSC 68. This is National Security Council Resolution 68. So again, permanent military buildup to push back against communism. The Soviets are going to develop their own nuclear weapons. So we're going to develop the nuclear triad and a second strike capacity. The nuclear triad, of course, is, bombers, of course, that can drop nuclear bombs, land-based ballistic missiles, and sea-based nuclear submarines. So this means that even if the entirety of the United States is destroyed, we still have a second strike capacity to fire enough nuclear weapons to destroy our enemies. And these Ohio-class submarines generally are out somewhere in the ocean, prepared just in case we need to strike back at our enemies. We're also going to create our foreign spy agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is going to become really important during the Cold War, doing surveillance, counter-ops, missions like that, the type of covert missions that are potentially necessary if you're fighting a massive global conflict with another foe that you can't actually fight a war with. We're also going to sign NATO or create NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty. This is Article 5, the Common Defense Clause. So take a moment, pause, and read it. The Soviet Union is going to create the Warsaw Pact in response, and these are our two mutual defense organizations, with the basic principle being an attack on any one of these members is an attack on all of them. So if the Soviet Union decides to invade West Berlin, it's exactly the same as if they launched an invasion of, Boston or something like that, and we would respond accordingly. So this sets the stage in Europe for the Cold War. For next time, we're going to look at the Cold War in Asia, the Chinese Civil War, and this conflict brewing on a peninsula called Korea. But we'll leave our story here for now, so thank you for listening.